Can the Iran nuclear deal survive without the United States? U.S. allies on edge as Donald Trump decides whether to re-certify the agreement. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the Iran nuclear deal. Donald Trump has called the Iran nuclear deal an embarrassment, but allies of the White House fear ripping up the agreement could lead to catastrophe. The US president is under immense pressure. Britain, France, Russia, China and the EU all signed on to the landmark deal, and decertifying the plan could leave the US isolated. But for Trump, his concerns aren't only about nuclear weapons. He says Iran's missile program puts Israel and Europe at risk. European leaders don't disagree, but for them, the question is how to proceed. Can they agree on a more confrontational policy, or will Trump's scorched earth approach prevail for better or worse? Yvette McCullough has more.
US President Donald Trump is due to announce a decision that could have far-reaching global consequences. Whether he will follow through on his rhetoric and decertify the Iran nuclear deal.
Never, ever have I seen
one of the worst deals I've ever seen.
Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment.
Iran has not lived up to the spirit of the agreement.
In 2015, the landmark deal was agreed to by Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program in return for the easing of economic sanctions. It was seen as a win for the path to world peace, and one of the defining features of Barack Obama's presidency. Every 90 days, the US president has to certify that the deal is still in the country's national interests and that Iran is meeting its obligations. But there's speculation Trump intends to decertify it, potentially pulling the US out of the deal and reimposing sanctions.
It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction.
We think this program is really one of the most important achievements of the international community.
It has played a positive and important role in ensuring nuclear non-proliferation and protecting peace and stability in the Middle East.
Our big concern is that the security situation would get worse if the US rejects the Iran nuclear deal, and not better.
Warnings and pleas for the US not to walk away from the deal from the international community, fearful of instability and military conflict. Supporters say the deal has achieved its aim of stopping Iran from developing nuclear weapons, and it has seen Iran engage with the international community again. The deal's European partners have indicated it will live on, with or without the US.
آمریکا بخواد علیه یک معاهده و قرارداد بین المللی که مورد تایید شورای امنیت سازمان ملل و اساساً بخشی از قطعنامه 2231 است. آمریکا تنها با ایران مخالفت نمیکنه الان. آمریکا داره با جهان مخالفت میکنه. آمریکا داره با سازمان ملل مبارزه میکنه.
But opponents to the deal say Iran is using it as cover to advance its military ambitions and expand its influence in the Middle East, and that it needs to be stopped. If Trump does decertify the deal, Congress will have 60 days to decide whether to reimpose sanctions on Iran. Will Trump make good on his threats and pull the US out of the nuclear deal? And will this lead to Iran once again being a pariah state, or to the US being the one left out on its own? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Elahi Mohtasham. She's an Iranian affairs analyst who's met with both Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Javad Zarif on nuclear issues. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, we have Rob Maness. He's a retired U.S. Air Force colonel. And in Washington, D.C., James Jatras. He's a former policy advisor for U.S. Senate Republicans. I thank you all for joining us. Rob Maness, let me begin with you. It's no secret that Trump wants to walk away from the deal. And I guess if you believe the a recent report from the Washington Post, Trump actually, quote, threw a fit when advisors suggested that they certify the deal and keep on going every 90 days. Tell me, what do you think? Do you think Trump should walk away from the deal?
Well, I think he absolutely should. Number one reason is that it was a campaign promise that he made, but more importantly is the deal is really bad for the United States of America and our allies. It virtually guarantees the Iranians will become a nuclear weapons power. It doesn't prevent ballistic missile technology from being further developed and tested, and we see what the problems are in North Korea. That's created when combined with the nuclear weapons capability that the West allowed North Korea to develop, and we appear to be on the same track with the Iranians. So I think it's a bad deal. We've got to get the missile technology and testing incorporated into any other agreements. And then finally, it's an illegal agreement under the Constitution of the United States. The United States Senate is the sole power for ratifying treaties. This is a treaty no matter what name was put on it by the Obama administration, and the Senate has not ratified it. So the United States needs to take another look at this. The best way to do that is to remove itself, decertify from the JCPOA, and I think another option would be, and I would recommend it, that the United States declare the Iranian Republican Guard Corps an international terrorist organization.
And you've laid it all out there, and we'll unpack all of that as we go along.
Mess around.
Okay, so before I bring in the others, just very briefly, since the deal was signed, Rob, is there any evidence whatsoever that Iran has gotten closer to developing a nuclear weapon? We're not talking about missiles. We're not talking about what it's doing in Syria, in Yemen, or anywhere else. But is there any shred of evidence that they're any closer to actually developing a nuclear weapon, Rob?
Well, we don't know because of the inspection regime in the agreement is not good enough. The IAEI gets soil samples mailed in and has to trust that the Iranians are properly collecting the soil samples. The IAEA nor any American organizations are allowed to inspect on-site those facilities or any military facilities. So the answer to your question is we really don't know, and that makes it evidence that, yes, they could possibly and probably are closer to development of a nuclear weapon.
Ilahi Muhtasham, the burden of proof is on the Iranians to prove that they're not developing a nuclear weapon, according to Rob Menes, not the other way around. Tell me why you think the deal is working and should continue, Ilahi.
Well, it's understanding of what the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and international legal obligations of Iran are under the IAEA agreements related to that treaty. Because under those treaties, if we are talking legally, under a legal international basis, it is not Iran who has to prove whether it has not or it has got nuclear weapons. Under the legal international treaty, Iran has obligations to provide access to the declared nuclear material that Iran has held inside Iran. So this is the legal definition. And the International Atomic Energy Authority, which has to verify that, has continuously says that it has verified that Iran's declared nuclear material, which has been under inspection, Iran has complied with that. Now, if we are not happy with what international legal situation is something very different from what we want the international legal situation to be. So I think we must not confuse with what we want the international legal situation be with what Iran has actually signed. Because under the international legal situation, Iran does not have any nuclear weapons or nuclear fissile material.
Okay. James Jatras, we've had the British Prime Minister Theresa May come out with a statement reaffirming the UK's strong commitment to the deal alongside our European partners. She said we've had Germany's ambassador to Washington, Peter Wittig, telling The Guardian to unravel this deal would jeopardize US credibility and also the credibility of the West in the world. Do you agree with that?
I think that it's likely that if the United States does withdraw from this agreement, that nobody will be with us. Even our usual poodles, the British, will not follow the American lead on this one, I believe. That's why I think President Trump will decertify the agreement, but then throw the ball into Congress's court to see whether they are willing within the 60-day period to enact what they call snapback sanctions. And I think that ball is up in the air. We don't know how that's likely to turn out. My guess is they probably will not, but they might try to enact other sanctions that are directed against other matters not covered by the agreement, for example, missile technology and things of this sort. I would question that Donald Trump is simply keeping a campaign promise here. He actually said during the campaign that it's a bad deal, but he did not say he would tear it up. He said he would try to make it better. And I think some people here have the idea that by decertifying, we can push Iran into either pulling out of the deal themselves, which I think they would be foolish to do, or we could try to impose on them a new deal with more stringent terms. And given that no other country will be with us on that, I think that's highly unlikely.
Mm-hmm. And James, given that a lot of the arguments being made against the deal will say Iran is aggressive, Iran is doing terrible things in the region, a lot of those things might be true, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Yemen. They speak of the $100 billion to conduct empire building. They mention the missile tests. All of these things might be happening, but is it unfair on Iran to bring up all those things when technically, when you actually talk about the deal itself, Iran seems to be compliant and not cheating?
I think it's not a question of fairness to Iran, but whether it's in our own national interest. If the limited purpose of the deal is to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, and experts like, for example, Scott Ritter have said that it is sufficient for that purpose, no deal is perfect. Yes, it might be nice to go fishing around in their their other military facilities to see what interesting things are over there as well. That's one of the problems with arms control agreements going all the way back between the United States and the Soviet Union. No deal is perfect, but the question is it sufficient for its purpose? And the idea that you could take a deal that seems to be working with whatever flaws or limitations it has and trash it and come up with something we might deem to be much more suitable for us, I think is simply unrealistic.
Rob Maness, you mentioned that you'd like to see Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, the IRGC, labeled as a terrorist organization. That has been floated in the past few days. Iran has responded by saying that they will then treat the US as ISIS. Well, I should say not Iran officially, but the IRGC spokesman, Bahram Qasemi, said they will start to treat the US as ISIS. You see where this is going, right? I mean, you have a deal where things are relatively stable between the United States and Iran. Go and label the IRGC as a terrorist organization and all hell might break loose.
I would disagree that things are relatively stable between the United States and Iran. And I would also add, just because the agreement seems to be being adhered to doesn't make the agreement in the interest of the United States. And the Iranians would be crazy to pull out of a nuclear agreement that's all in their favor, which excludes ballistic missile technology, which doesn't hold to task the IRGC for its terrorist activities throughout the Middle East, and that changes the balance of power away from America's allies. So the United States to decertify is a good first step. I think the president is going to do that. But I also believe that we should declare the IRGC an international terrorist organization based on their behavior and the facts. Now, the IRGC can do whatever it likes, or the Iranians can do whatever they like about the United States Army. But the United States Army will continue to do its mission to protect the interests of the United States of America and its allies and work with our allies such as NATO.
Okay, Elahi Mohtashim, let me ask you then, if, for example, Emmanuel Macron has his way and he finds some sort of compromise here where he has said, why don't we all renegotiate and include missiles, right? And people are hoping, many people are hoping Donald Trump goes in that direction. Would the Iranians renegotiate by including missiles and trying to rein in their missile program as a part of the Iran deal? Would they?
Yeah. I think as part of answer to your question, it's very important to analyze and explain what the actual nature of the deal is. The nature of the deal is that it is a public relations, confidence building, political deal. It's not a technological detail related to, I mean, for many people, especially our participants who have contributed in this debate today now, it's not really about the technologies of involved. It is a very political deal. And even if it is, in my opinion, based on what I have studied from Iran's debates internally, and even if the whole deal is decertified, for example, by President Trump, it is my belief that nothing serious, the devastation that many people talk about, nothing serious would happen. The reason is that there are many people inside Iran, the same as many people inside the United States, who are opposing this deal. Many people are saying that as a political vehicle to advance Iran's national interest, the deal is not working. Yes, it has provided some economic benefit in terms of selling of Iran's oil, but in terms of investment, bringing capital to Iran, it hasn't been working. But yes, it has helped with the recession, but not, that much.
Certainly. If you'll allow me to come in here, right? And you know Iran better than I.
What I'm saying is that there is no disaster is going to happen.
Okay.
No, because even if this deal is going off, United States cannot go into war with Iran, for example. Iran is not like
let me take what you
any
said.
other country that, Iran is not like Syria attacking
so hold on.
Iran.
If you'll allow me to come in, let me take what you said and question it. Let me question it, right? So you have billions of dollars of deals in the works, right? Because economically, this has been fantastic for many companies, for the government. You have billions of dollars of deals in the works. This has been a deal that was the brainchild of the reformist camp, Rouhani, Zarif, and the like. You have hardliners who oppose the deal. If the US scraps it, won't this empower the hardliners who say, you see, we cannot talk to the West, we can't talk to those people, we can't trust them, and wouldn't that weaken the reformist camp? Ilahi?
Yes, it does weaken the reformist camp in terms of economic values that in the long term it would bring to Iran. But once the deal is off in terms of security, military, strategic position of Iran, it's not going to be disastrous. I mean, what could Trump do after decertifying this deal? If the deal goes off, what are the options available to United States? Is it going to attack Iran militarily? Even in terms of even in economic terms speaking, Iran is today in much more a stronger position economically than it was after. My point is that this is a very important point. Do you know why? Because if the aim of President Trump and administration is to force Iran into, I'm in a sense answering directly your question in terms of missiles, if the intent is to force Iran into bringing into the negotiations the missiles, restriction on missiles, and other issues like Iran's involvement in the Middle East, it's not going to work. It's not going to work because economically it's not going to hurt Iran as much as giving up its missiles or giving up its involvement in Syria or with Hezbollah, etc. So
I need to bring in James. Point. Ilahi, I need to bring in James Jatras. James Jatras. A soft decertification, if you like, some sort of compromise position. Is that tenable? Can it work? And can it prevent chaos?
Well, I don't know if it can be as a moderate position. No, I don't think so. I think what we could have is if the president decertifies the deal and Congress does not enact new sanctions, essentially the United States is still in the deal, whether or not it's been decertified. It's sort of a weird middle ground for us to be in. I think the bigger question is what other shoes may drop. With his decertification, President Trump is expected to unfold a broader policy agenda toward Iran. And let's be honest here, there are an awful lot of people here in Washington who are against this deal because what they really want is regime change in Tehran. They would like to see a replay of what happened in Iraq in 2003 and in Libya in 2011, and they would like nothing better for more hardline elements to come to power in Tehran. They would like nothing better than some kind of a pretext they can use to launch war against Iran. And I think President Trump has to be very, very careful here because he said he wanted to get away from these wars like Iraq and Libya. And instead, I think he's being boxed in here, let's be honest here, by the partisans of Israel and of Saudi Arabia, our two closest partners in the region that are inveterate enemies of Iran.
Okay, well, for the moment, the Defense Secretary Mattis told a Senate hearing that it's in the national interest to keep the agreement alive. So Mattis seems to think it's a good deal for now. We'll be watching this closely. It'll be interesting to see what Trump does with the deal, whether he decertifies it or not. Rob Menace, James Jatras, and Ilahi Mohtasham. I've got to move on, but I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come, will Liberia's presidential election upend the country's recent stability? And after countless war crimes in Syria, prosecutors get their first conviction. We ask, why did it take so long? Corruption, civil war, and an Ebola outbreak. Just a few of the problems that dogged Liberia's outgoing president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. The Nobel Peace Prize winner brought relative stability to the troubled country. But after 12 years in charge, term limits are forcing her to step down. Well, Liberians went to the polls and observers hailed what looks to be the country's first democratic transfer of power in 73 years. But some are worried. Voters had 20 candidates to choose from, and as the ballots are counted, the country could be put into the hands of a football legend or a former warlord. Shoaib Hassan has more.
It brought an end to years of war in Liberia, and now it's wrapping up. The tenure of Nobel Prize-winning President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is regarded by many Liberians as the best in the country's history. Others say she has not delivered on her promises to truly move the country forward. It still relies heavily on foreign aid, and the emancipation of women is still a problem. But her 12 years in office has ensured that these Liberians are free to choose whoever they want as the next president.
After this election, I'm looking for a leader that is transparent, a leader that will seek the interests of the people.
2.2 million Liberians were registered to vote for the new president. They chose among 20 candidates. 2 are independent and 18 belong to political parties. The candidate who wins 50% or more of the vote will be elected president. If no candidate wins 50%, there will be a runoff between the top 2 contenders. Such a runoff is shaping up between international football star George Weah and Vice President Joseph Boakai. But the most reassuring development for observers has been the lack of violence in the polling. It's the first time since 1943 that a smooth transfer of power will take place without international intervention. Liberia had been crippled by violence for years as rival militias fought each other. That was before Sirleaf was elected the first female African head of state. The vote was the start of Liberia's transformation.
Remember that you are an empowered people The future of the country is in your hands. No one is entitled to your vote. Vote for the person and persons you believe will make Liberia a better place.
That person will determine whether that trend continues. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Alex Vines, who heads the Africa program at Chatham House, and he's a former UN advisor on Liberia. And in Nairobi is Nanjala Nyabola. She's a writer and analyst with a focus on African politics. I thank you both for joining us. Nanjala, let me begin with you. So this could be the country's first democratic transition of power in more than 70 years. How important is this vote for the people of Liberia?
I think it's incredibly important. As you've mentioned, Liberia has been one of the most conflict-ridden countries, not just in Africa, but around the world. And I think it would be a huge symbolic victory for the people of the country for them to see a successful democratic transition. We've seen in other countries that have had a similar past, in Nigeria, where you've had a lot of coup d'etat, a lot of military takeovers of the state. You've seen the same in Ghana, that having that first democratic transition really goes a long way towards consolidating political participation, towards consolidating belief in the republic, even, if you will. Both Nigeria and Ghana have benefited tremendously economically, politically, and socially just from having that peaceful handover of power, civilian handover of power. So I do think it's a really important event in Liberia.
Yeah, so before we talk about who would be best for the country, let's talk a little bit about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's legacy. Alex Vines, has it been a good 12 years?
It's been a mixed 12 years, but it's true that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf has served 2 terms. She was elected first time and then re-elected. And the country has been peaceful. There hasn't been conflict. It got badly knocked back, as your listeners and viewers will know, with Ebola. But the country is at peace, and that is a tremendous credit to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, that she has provided that stability over her 2 terms. In terms of economic growth, efforts against corruption, inequality, there's a much more mixed record. The reality is that Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is better regarded, she's more famous outside Liberia than she is in Liberia itself. And I think it was very telling that she has kept a very low profile in the run-up to this election that's just happened in Liberia, not even signaling which candidate she would prefer, for the simple reason that that might actually reduce support for a particular candidate.
Nanjala Nyabola, mixed legacy?
Absolutely mixed legacy. Like Alex has said, within Liberia there was a lot of concerns about nepotism, a lot of concerns about corruption. She made a lot of really big promises when she ascended power, and the sense in Liberia for a lot of Liberians is that she didn't deliver on some of the major things that were hurting them. And corruption, as I said, is a big part of them. But, you know, appointing her sons to key government positions at a time when the country is still grappling with cleaning up the public service, even if her intentions were good, it doesn't look good, I think, for the general public. And especially on women's rights, I think being the first female president in Africa, there was a lot of expectations that she would do more for women's rights. There was a lot of expectations that she would be fighting a lot of key battles on FGM, on access to healthcare. Liberia has one of the worst statistics for access to healthcare, and that falls disproportionately on women. And the general sense is that she didn't actually deliver on those things.
Alex, Twitter seemed to have jumped the gun late last night. Well, not Twitter itself, but a lot of people on Twitter saying George Weah's got it, he's the next president. And then people dialed it back and said, well, it's not official, we don't quite know. Tell me, who would be the right candidate for the presidency? Who would you like to win?
Oh, look, that's a really tough question, and we don't know who's won. My working assumption is that there'll probably need to be a runoff, that George Weah's definitely seems, from my informants in Liberia, is leading in certain parts of the country, but the former vice president is also leading in another part of the country, and the former warlord, also Prince Johnson, is leading in another part of the country. So we'll have to see on that. I mean, George Weah is obviously well known internationally because of his football career, and he's certainly attractive to Liberian youth. And so the youth vote might well have come out stronger for him. The issue about experience and technocratic ability, then you would have to say it's the vice president, the Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's vice president, who's now standing for president, Mr. Bukai. He would be the one that might bring more of the experience. I do have some concerns also that the wife of the former President Charles Taylor, Jewel Taylor, is the running mate of George Weah, and that raises a number of issues in my mind too.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, everybody's focusing on his Ballon d'Or and football legacy. Not many people have mentioned that. Nanjala, George Weah, Prince Johnson, or Joseph Boakai, who's the right candidate to take that stability and translate it into prosperity?
I think it depends on on what priorities Liberians set for themselves moving forward. As Alex has said, George Weah does have that name brand recognition, and he does bring a measure of, what you don't want to do is what exactly happened with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, which is to have these tremendously high expectations that will be almost impossible to meet. And when you have someone like that who has that name brand recognition that George Weah has, who has been promising, I mean, he ran against Ellen Johnson Sirleaf before and has been promising the same massive changes that she promised and was unable to deliver on. There's always that risk that it will lead to frustration. And leading to frustration in a country with a history of conflict, it raises the temperature of and raises the prospect of perhaps not necessarily a generalized return to violence, but perhaps a localized return to violence, especially with a frustrated young population. If, on the other hand, your priorities are economic, then, well, maybe you have Bukai would be a better candidate. That this is a person who, might be a safe pair of hands for the economy. Having said that, again, Liberia is getting really hit really hard by the fall in global commodity prices, by the fall, the lower interest in purchasing diamonds or purchasing, timber from Liberia. And I think it would be whoever takes over is going to have a very big job ahead of them to stabilize the economy, to address some of the structural issues that Sirleaf has been unable to address in the 12 years that she's been president.
Yeah, and so we're still in this kind of election process. They have until October 25th to announce the winner. In the meantime, Alex, the Liberty Party candidate Charles Brumskeen has said there are irregularities. Now, the international observers, the ECOWAS observers, the AU observers have said things are relatively fine. They don't have any problems. Brumskeen saying, no, there are major problems and he wants a rerun. I mean, this might be sour grapes if there's no evidence. However, is there the possibility of chaos on the streets and instability on the streets if someone like Brumskeen says he doesn't recognize the results of the election, or is he too small of a player?
I think he's too small of a player, and the international observers, I mean, I have a colleague who's on one of the observer teams. They've been pretty impressed. The elections have been very impressive from what I'm hearing from Liberia, 2.1 million registered voters, and there have been some irregularities. One area I know has been sanitized at the moment because of irregularities, but the overall picture is a pretty positive one. So I tend to think we don't need to worry about that particular scenario. This is not the high drama that we're seeing in Kenya, for example, at the moment that's playing out.
Nanjala, yeah, you're smiling because you're in Kenya, and we've spoken about this before as well. I mean, many Kenyans I've spoken to recently have been embarrassed at how things have played out because Kenya is supposed to be, a power on the continent. Does it warm your heart that in Liberia right now we're seeing an election play out freely and fairly?
It warms my heart. It really does. And I think it's really encouraging to see. I think democratic gains in West Africa in general have been tremendous in the last 5-10 years. And I think it's important to celebrate that. I think, just looking a little bit further west, looking at the Gambia and what we saw in December of this year, looking at Nigeria, looking at Ghana, there's been some significant, Burkina Faso, there's been some significant democratic gains in West Africa after a long period of uncertainty and a lot of political violence and a lot of instability. And for us in East Africa, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing a lot of reversal of a lot of democratic gains, not just in Kenya, in Uganda, in Tanzania, shrinking space for civil society, a shrinking space for political participation. So while it warms my heart, I'm also a little bit jealous, to be honest, for them to be able to go to the polls so cleanly and have that belief and waiting on the system after such a long period of political turmoil. Yeah, I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, and as we kind of bring this all the way back to the beginning, Alex, you mentioned the context. This is a country that has been through a lot. The legacy of that civil war is a shadow that still hangs over so many people. And then, just when things were sort of getting stable, they were hit by Ebola. I mean, this is a country has experienced a lot. That was the context, and that's why you said, Alex, that one of the successes of President Sirleaf was just kind of keeping things together. But as things stand now in 2017, if I had to ask you, what do Liberians want? What would you say?
Inclusive growth. They want jobs and inclusive growth, and it's going to have to be the economy and inequality that is the focus. And particularly youth employment. The population is very youthful, and the next president is going to have to focus much more on those sorts of issues. That's what Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was not successful enough about.
I've got to move on. I thank you both for joining us on the Newsmakers.
My name is Nael Bitari. I'm originally Palestinian from Syria. I grew up in Syria and I was born there. I left Syria to Lebanon in 2012. I stayed there for like 2.5 years, and then I moved to Sweden. I had accepted in a program in a Swedish Institute for young leaders in Middle East. Meanwhile, I'm attending the program. The Lebanese authorities prevented Palestinian Syrians to enter Lebanon. I'm a stateless, and I have no paper, so it's kind of good to have paper here in Sweden. I've started an initiative in Sweden in 2015 called Refugee Without Borders, like in order to better the understanding between the different cultures in Sweden. And I go through art mostly in this organization. It's rarely to find a Swedish family with an immigrant family hanging out together or doing this. It's not really common here. But not only with between Swedish family and immigrant family, it's the same between the immigrants groups in general. There is some gaps of understanding and accepting what the people think, how do they think, why do they think like that. So what we do is just to try to fill these gaps with art. And sometimes we go to discuss sensitive issues in the cultures, such like the gender equality. Some people think, yeah, Islam is very closed. But then when we talk about that, they discover that, no, it's not about Islam, it's about traditions and the customs in the country. Sometimes I think about Syria, I feel like, yeah, thanks God, I'm here, I'm not in Syria. And it's good for me to have a new life. But in the same time, when it comes for the social circles, yeah, I miss that in Syria. It was very nice in Syria. What I'm planning to now is continuing my studying and going to the academia life. I mean, like, I aim to go to the PhD. If I can do something good for the social life here, that would be great. So I'll try to do it through my studies and my work.
For the first time in the Syrian conflict, a regime soldier has been prosecuted for a war crime. The evidence against him? A Facebook post. Mohammed Abdullah claimed asylum in Sweden in 2015, but activists recognized him from this online photo, smiling, surrounded by dead bodies. So instead of receiving refuge, he got an 8-month prison sentence for mistreating corpses. Now, the Syrian conflict has been going on for 6 years. So why is this the first time prosecutors got a conviction? Well, Yasser Tabara is here to help us answer that question. He's a senior fellow at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies and a former spokesman for the Syrian interim government. Yasser, good to have you on the program again. So this guy, asylum seeker, Syrian, goes to Sweden, Mohammed Abdullah. These activists, notify the authorities and he's locked up for 8 months. How important is this ruling?
Well, obviously 8 months for something so horrific that, akin to basically a war crime is a little bit more than a slap on the face, on the wrist. However, I think considering that over the past 7 years you have hundreds of thousands of people that have been subjected to the most brutal of executions and war crimes, it is significant that this is the first incident of international accountability and end of impunity for these types of crimes.
Do you accept the judge's decision that you can't prove from the photograph unless he actually confesses that he actually killed anybody? Well, he was there. Yeah.
That is essentially the biggest problem in prosecuting in countries that have very little connection to the crime that took place, that the act took place at. And as we know, Sweden and Germany and now other European countries, including Switzerland, they're activating this universal jurisdiction aspect of their criminal justice system. And so that is the sort of the weak link of universal jurisdiction, the inability to collect evidence, the inability to go through the chain of custody of evidence and interview witnesses and be on the scene of the crime to be able to collect the type of data that is required to come to a conviction. And so, yes, I do sympathize with the Swedish judge for not being able to give more. I don't know the particulars of the case. I wasn't part of the legal team or anything like that. But from what I've read, it is extremely difficult to actually achieve a conviction of a crime of that magnitude without having the collection of evidence. And I think that is the responsibility of the international community. That has been the responsibility of the international community, considering the inaccess that they have been given by the Assad regime to Syrian land.
Yeah, so we know the limitations of universal jurisdiction. It's very hard to actually investigate on the ground. But just in a general sense, 6 years on, for those who are asking, never mind the foot soldiers, what about the colonels, what about the generals? All these people who are part of this killing machine, if you like. Why has not a single person been prosecuted when you have hundreds of thousands of people who are dead?
That is the million-dollar question when it comes to international criminal justice. International criminal justice lacks enforceability, plain and simple, or it lacks objective enforceability, I should say, because it has always been, throughout history, victor's justice when it comes to prosecutions of war crimes and things of that nature. The Russians, for example, and the Chinese have been putting the main obstacle in front of the referral of the Syria investigation to the International Criminal Court, which is the body that supposedly has the jurisdiction over the war crimes and crimes against humanity and other crimes that have been committed in Syria over the past 7 years. And that is purely because of political reasons and political posturing. And I think that international criminal law will always be held hostage to these considerations, and it has been in Syria for the past 7 years.
Interestingly, on the other side of the coin, if you like, if you put Assad's regime away and we look at the other side, we've seen life sentences, right, when it came to people who were convicted of killing or executing regime soldiers. So we saw it in Sweden, we saw it in Austria as well. With one guy, it was a video, so there was video evidence. With the other guy, it was a confession during his immigration discussion. So we had these asylum seekers. Now, they weren't Daesh members, but they joined other extremist rebel groups, and they confessed to or were found to have killed or executed Syrian regime soldiers. When those guys get life sentences. Do you feel that is just?
Well, again, I mean, that's something that, the legal process is an extremely technical process, and it's a very complex process. And so one cannot make any of these determinations unless they look at the evidence and evaluate it for themselves. I assume that for those types of cases, ample evidence a lot more evidence was provided than the case of Mohammed Abdullah that we saw conclude last week. But what I would like to do is just take a few steps back and take a look at the larger picture. You have now European governments and you have now international community speaking of rehabilitating or bringing the Assad regime back into the international fold. And as you said, forget about these foot soldiers. I mean, prosecuting someone like Mohammed Abdullah is akin to prosecuting a guard at Auschwitz when the generals roam free. What really needs to happen is for these types of cases to send a clear signal to the European governments, to the politicians, to the international community that engaging with the Assad regime when they have enabled and have directly committed and systematically committed these horrific human rights violations and this violation of international humanitarian law and international criminal law will come with a cost. And hopefully that these types of cases, these types of convictions, small as they may be, could be somewhat of a deterrence of these political processes of rehabilitating the Assad regime and its cohorts.
But there are those who would say that's not rehabilitation of the Assad regime. It's just getting a deal, no matter how bad it is. If it includes Assad, it puts out the fire.
Well, at least we could leverage the issue of accountability to end the human rights abuses that are taking place as we speak.
Right.
Tens of thousands of detainees still suffer in Assad prisons. We have thousands of detainees that are being tortured to death as we speak. And so I think a lot of that could be, look, it has to be part of a comprehensive political package. If we're going in the direction of ending the hostilities and sacrificing a lot of the rights and a lot of the concepts of justice that have really been violated over the past 7 years, then at least we would want to do it in a way that would produce freedom and positive results for those who are suffering as we speak.
Right, and you've been speaking about the big picture and the politics of it all. If you'll allow me very finally to kind of go granular again and go back to the base level of this with the foot soldiers. In a country with conscription, and we've read about, for example, Alawites who have been trying to dodge the draft and leave the country and so on. In a country with conscription, what's your take on those who might be fleeing, who might have been soldiers, who might not have committed any war crimes, but who were Syrian regime soldiers at a time when the regime was committing terrible acts and are trying to get into Europe? Do you think they should be given asylum?
Well, again, it depends on what they act on their own volition and what they were forced to do. Right. This is, as you know, the asylum-seeking process in Europe and a lot of these European countries is very stringent, and they go under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of basic detailed questions as to what groups they belong to, what acts that they have committed, the circumstances around them seeking asylum. But yes, obviously, within the tenets of international criminal law, if you are a foot soldier and you were forced to do something that is contrary to ethics and human rights, then it is your commander that is held responsible for that act more than the foot soldier themselves. So yes, I think those things must be taken into consideration, and these people have to be given due process and due diligence.
Will there only really be true justice once the war is over?
I highly doubt that. The history of international criminal justice shows us that it was always a product or a function of the victorious politics of the time. And so there are many mechanisms that we can move forward in that potentially can deliver, partial justice, that can deliver a certain measure of transitional peace and transitional tranquility. But to attain absolute justice is something that, as Syrians, I think most Syrians have give up on. Just seeing how the dynamics of the international powers have played out in the past 7 years, especially in the past couple of years, where you have a major international power that, as we speak, has been committing war crimes by using air force in different parts of Syria. So how do you reconcile that with a transitional process that actually seeks accountability? I'm not sure.
Yasser Tabbara, always a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Until then, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.